The title of this talk today, Good Morning Derby, University of Derby. I was here, was it 2 years ago, 3 years ago, in that big dome in Buxton. It was a fantastic location. And then, this was just a glint in people's eye, the idea of forming, a separate entity. And actually, Julie asked me last night, do you think it was wise, on the phone actually, she said, do you think it was wise that we set up an online entity that was separate from the body politic? And my answer to that was an unqualified yes. And it was an unqualified yes because I live in Brighton, don't be fooled by my accent, and I worked with a guy called David Watson there who was the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Brighton, who wrote a brilliant paper. And in that paper, he made a distinction between projects which he called tortoise projects and mosquito projects. And his claim was that most government interference in higher education were actually mosquito interference things that sort of last for a day and then die at some point. But a very few last a long time. They have the longevity and sustainability of maybe a century, like a tortoise. And I think, in a sense, you almost have to do something substantial in this area if you're going to have longevity, scalability, and sustainability. And we have a perfect example of that in this country, which is the Open University. When people say online learning doesn't work, we need lecturers, say, oh, hold on, there are 230,000 students in the Open University. It's bigger than any university in Europe, but there's nobody on the campus. We already have the evidence that this works on a grand scale. And there are plenty of other examples, even Janet, Super Janet, some of the gist. But when you go for scale, things start to work. Now, the title of my sort of rant today is From Gutenberg to Zuckerberg. It could have been From Plato to Zuckerberg, but it didn't scan quite as well. So, and I'm going to start with a really bold claim here, which is that there's been more pedagogic change in the last decade, 10 years, than there has been in the last 1,000 years. So Plato is an appropriate starting point there. That may seem like a hyperbolic claim, but I really do believe that this is true. And I'm not saying that that has happened within educational institutions, but I think in terms of the way people look in the outside world, people like me, who don't attend lectures, go to educational institutions. I'm 55 years old. I haven't been on a course for 30 years. I wouldn't go on a course because the world has come to me. And I think when you look at the behavior of young people today, that's true of them as well. Because in the last 10 years, some amazing things have happened. You might imagine that Facebook is 20, 30-year-old, but it's not really. It was actually launched seriously in 2003, Twitter 2006. Some of this is incredibly recent, but it seems as though it's been there forever. The first broadband connection in the UK into the home was in 1998. Some of this stuff is incredibly recent. And the way in which I like to think about these problems, going back to my first statement, was to focus on one word, and it's a big word, and that's scalability. The Open University has scalability. Wikipedia has scalability. And if we don't focus on that word, we will not have sustainable solutions going forward. So I want to focus very much on that word as we move forward. And there are different meanings of the word scalability. We have scalability of ideas through journals, but we all know that research is incredibly hard to scale. Let's say technology research by JISC and universities and the use of technology. Almost all of those research projects are mosquito projects because they didn't have scalability and sustainability in them. And sometimes they remain stuck in one department, certainly a single institution, unless they have the scalability of something like Janet or Super Janet. The scalability of books, but that's simply replication. True scalability in the world of digital abundance means almost infinite free scalability. That's the difference. It's a quantum leap in terms of the meaning of the word, which is what Wikipedia, Google, YouTube, 101 things that you're all aware of gives you. How many people have heard of Salman Khan? Nobody at all. A couple of people, right? A couple of people. Okay. If you were in the States, this guy's appeared on CNN, and Obama's met him, and Bill Gates has just given him a whole load of money and so on. And he's sort of rocking the boats of people over there because he's done something really quite astonishing, I think. I'm going to give you some sort of lessons from the frontier, as it were, things that I feel I've learned from over the last year, certainly, that have changed my view of how things should be delivered in education. And this guy's certainly one of them. He was actually a hedge fund manager, a mathematician by background. And he was doing something actually I was doing as well. In Brighton, I teach kids maths using Skype in my local comprehensive school. These are kids who are just struggling to get anything done, hate maths, 14, 15-year-old boys. All of them were boys. And he was doing the same thing. He was teaching his cousins in the States using Skype as well. But what he did, he went one step further, started producing little 2-minute YouTube videos on basic maths, science, now economics, art history, all sorts of things. And he flipped the model. He calls it a flip model. And he's saying, why on earth do teachers in classrooms or in lecture halls simply do exposition? Why aren't they teaching? Why aren't they giving students formative feedback, doing all that sophisticated stuff that really good teachers know about and do well? Why are we so obsessed by standing there, normally for an hour, and talking at people? Because this happens in secondary schools as well. If you look at vector data, teachers still do a hell of a lot of basic exposition as opposed to teaching. So his model was 2,800 videos. They're all very short. I do believe that real pedagogic change is coming from the technology. People say all the time, oh, it's not about the technology, Donald, it's about the learning, it's about the pedagogy. Well, I'm sorry, but there hasn't been much pedagogic change. But if you look at the way video has been used in terms of episodic memory and learning and retention, where do we get our pedagogic change? We got it from YouTube, because any 12-year-old will tell you that you don't make a video that's a half an hour or an hour long, a la BBC, to fit in a Radio Times timetable, in the same way that a lecture is an hour long because the Babylonians had a base 60 number system and you had to timetable it. It's got nothing to do with the psychology of learning. In fact, it does the very opposite of what the psychology of learning says. It goes on too long and they're too boring. And he flips the model because he's saying, let the kids do what Sugata suggested. Let them pick up the exposition from these short videos and then use the classroom as a place to teach. Completely flips the model. And if you don't think these videos are any good, have a look at some of this stuff. You know, when he's giving you a little 2 minutes on the scale of the sun in relation to the Earth, he describes the speed of a bullet coming out of a rifle. How long would that bullet take to go around the sun if you were riding on the back of the bullet? And the answer is an astounding 6 months. The sun is always much bigger than you actually think of it, getting on for nearly 1 million miles across. So, you know, this is good stuff, good teaching. And he doesn't appear. He doesn't want to lecture kids because he's not part of their peer group. The first thing I learned when I was teaching young kids maths that I was never ever going to be part of their world. And if you've had teenage boys or girls, you'll know that at some point they turn on you and they do not regard you as part of their universe and they learn from their peer group. I have twin boys. My wife's Scottish. Do you think they have a Scottish accent? No, they were brought up in Brighton because they've learned English from their peer group. And that's the main social and learning influence on these kids. 110 million people have viewed these videos. An average academic at 200 students a year will hit, in your whole lifetime, maybe about 4,000 to 6,000 students. And this guy, in a year, has hit 110 million. And that's what I mean by scalability, when you get this right and you start sharing stuff. And it's not just about videos and YouTube, because the back-end software here is really coming of age as well. In basic maths here, you cannot go from one stage to another in basic addition to multiplication and so on without being tested well. Good, interesting, and relevant formative assessment before you ever get to end summative assessment. That whole notion of waiting till it's too late and then somebody fails and that's it, you're out, which is what most assessment's still about. In these systems, you do streak tests. Now, I don't know if anybody here has taught maths, but it's incredibly dangerous for kids to get 70% in a test in maths and then move on. Because by the time they get to multiplication, division, the higher end of the maths, they've sort of lost it, because what they really needed was full competence at stage 1 and 2 to get to stage 3 and 4. So you get massive failure. You know, 6 million people are basically numerate in this country because we don't teach maths as it should be. In this system, you cannot proceed from addition to multiplication without going through 10 questions which you absolutely get right in streak assessment. And then on top of that, there's a huge amount of data which the institution, the teacher, the parent, the student themselves has access to with regard to how much time you spent on video, the blue bits, how much time you spent on the exercises, your overall energy points here. Incredibly sophisticated bits of software that lie behind the learning experience for the student. Okay, a second case study. And this guy learned a lot from Salman Khan. And this is in higher education in the States, in Stanford. Sebastian Thrun is a pretty smart guy. He's the head of the sort of leading edge labs in Google. This is one of the top software engineers on the planet. He also teaches at Stanford. 200 students a time, artificial intelligence, high-end maths courses, really. He saw what Salman Khan did and went back to faculty and said, suppose we just make this course that we're doing this year free. We'll just put it online. But we'll do something a la Salman Khan. We'll flip it. We'll flip the lectures. There will be no lectures. We will simply pose problems with lots of formative feedback for students as they go through the course. So he launched this course. Remember, he had 200 students in his course. It jumped, and these are at Stanford. They're paying $30,000 a year in Ivy League. Well, it's not an Ivy League, but they're paying that. 160,000 people signed up for the course. 160,000. Two good friends of mine went through this course, and it was an astonishing experience. And he started getting emails from all over the world, from people in Afghanistan and China, saying how personal they found the course, because it was giving them a much greater level of formative feedback, because as soon as you got stuck on a problem, it gave you excellent remedial feedback so that you didn't get stuck on the maths before proceeding to the next stage. He then, at the end of this course, said, I'm never going to teach again in a university. He just stopped, and he walked out of Stanford. And he set up a thing called Udacity.com, and his next course, which is about to be launched, is on how to build a search engine, an area he's another expert in, and his target is 500,000 students. 500,000. You know, twice the number of people that are even in the Open University. Simply by flipping the lecture model and almost eliminating lectures and concentrating on high-end bits of software that really support the learners with peer-to-peer learning. That was the course, Artificial Intelligence. Again, he decided not to appear in the videos, interestingly. And the argument is that when the person is there, it appeals to your episodic memory, you know, the way you remember events, almost like pieces of video in your life, as opposed to semantic memory. Remember, these guys are teaching science and deep maths. It's largely semantic knowledge they're trying to get across. And that the person, in a sense, was the problem. And if you don't think that's a problem, go to physics lectures, go to maths lectures, you know, and you will see somebody normally with their back to you for 50 minutes on a chalkboard. And that hasn't changed in 100 years or so. I mentioned Martin because I think we almost have to get out of this idea also that the 18-year-old undergraduate is the normal model for us here. The world of higher education demographically has changed and will continue to change with more part-time students, more older students. And I think we have to listen to what this guy, you cannot open a newspaper at the moment without seeing an ad for the OU. And believe me, this guy's going after 500,000 students. And if you don't, I mean, does anybody seriously think that the Open University should be shut down? That it's a poor experience for students? Look at the scoring they get when they ask their students. It's a different group of students, granted. Interesting nevertheless. Now, I said the last 1,000 years, and this image comes from a book, actually, a little manuscript. And if you look very carefully at the guy, this is from the University of Bologna, about 1340. The guy's lecturing in the lectern up here. Very odd job description, lecturer. Is that what people should be doing? You know, you're defined almost by one very narrow, very odd pedagogic technique in a way. And if you look very carefully at this audience, though, remember this is 1340, the artist really nailed this, you know, the guy's fast asleep in the back row. Look very carefully, the guy up here, I think he's on his BlackBerry. Not one person in the whole audience is actually listening because this guy, he got it even then, that it was dull, that an hour was too long, that we needed more active teaching. Another groundbreaking piece of research, which I think you know, is beholden to anyone who's interested in technology and learning should really study in some detail, is Carol Twiggs' work. And this was substantially funded at $8.8 million. And she went into 30 different institutions and really changed the courses. She said, don't fiddle about. Don't just put a little cherry on the cake here. Actually redesign the course around the technology. If you just do a little pre-work or a little bit of e-assessment at the end, that's not the point. In every case, in all 30 case studies, and these are colleges right up to Ivy League universities, was it cost effective? Yes. Better learning? Yes. Did they reduce dropout rates? Incredibly important, yes. It's interesting in the UK that we don't even know how many kids don't attend lectures. We don't count it. Isn't that bizarre? Imagine running a restaurant and many of the people who paid for the meal don't turn up. Wouldn't you say there's something wrong with the food? Something wrong with the restaurant? Something wrong with the very model itself? In the University of Brighton, where I know the current Vice-Chancellor, I know of courses where sometimes no students turn up for the lecture. Isn't that bizarre? Now, what she did, just to come back to the conclusions, it was an astounding piece of work, this. What really did make it work? What's going to make the University of Derby Online work? A couple of things she recommended. Concentrate on large enrollment. In other words, the larger courses seem to work better with this stuff because you can get the scalability of the software to work. And also, interestingly, it's not just maths and those sort of easy to test, therefore easy to teach online courses. Almost every subject they looked at, and they picked a range of subjects, was amenable to this sort of treatment. Just meant a different approach. But this is the big one in the middle. Don't fiddle about. Redesign the course. Do it properly. Don't just stick with your core, slabbing out 3 lectures a week type model. You've really got to change it. I'm not saying eliminate lectures, and I'm not against lectures full stop. I think there's an important role for that demonstration of knowledge by an expert to students, that humanistic tradition of passing knowledge from one generation down to another. But to simply regard it as the primary pedagogic technique in any learning context is, in my view, almost pathetic. You know, if I were a journalist or a novelist, I wouldn't say I'm going to read out my article. I'll read my novel to you. I'm only going to read it out to you once. You better listen and take notes, by the way, because you're never going to hear it again. You go, are you mad? Are you crazy? And what does the psychology of learning tell us about how memory works? You need repeated access to the content. You need repeated practice. And that's what we don't give them. We almost keep our knowledge away from students by delivering it once and not recording it. Active learning was mentioned by Philip already. When you really look, and I'm not so keen on simply recording lectures. As Philip said, just to do what you do in the real world and put it online isn't a solution necessarily to the problem. But at least it gives people a second, third, fourth bite of the cherry. And when you look at the good studies that are done in this area and look at what students do when you do record lectures, and this one's from the University of Trieste, again, it's physics, the subject I know most about, watching 13 hours a week on average, 13 hours of lectures, recorded lectures they're watching. And believe me, the guys who did this in the Physics Institute knew that the lecturers would not change their habits. They were largely introverts, didn't like facing audiences, and did walk up and down a chalkboard for 15 minutes doing the maths. And they have a very simple system, a still every 15 minutes with audio. And the kids, it's still primitive, 13 hours a week on average. Why? Do students love this? Because the lectures went too fast, they could review the lecture, they could revise for exams, they could clarify the ridiculously bad handwriting, which most of the physics lecturers had. English was many of the students' second language. Avoiding writing notes, seeing the lecture missing, if you missed a lecture through illness. There's all sorts of reasons why you should be recording lectures. And more importantly, they found at the end that attainment dog-legged. Students just learned more. Another interesting paper from the University of Eindhoven. This really surprised me when I saw this presented at all. The guys, it was actually a PhD thesis that will be published shortly. The conclusion, that they're trying to get a good title for this paper, is recording can improve a bad lecture. It's a very interesting statement, this. Recording a lecture can improve a bad lecture. Why should this be so? Well, when they actually looked at what students were doing with recorded lectures, they fast-forward all the dull bits. Now, I've given lots of lectures, you've given lots of lectures. If you don't pad your lectures out to an hour, like everybody else on the planet, I simply don't believe you. If your lectures don't have some really boring bits in them, I don't believe you. We all pad things out to an hour, because the hour exists absurdly. And of course, students are smart on this. They miss the tangential stuff, the boring introduction, the crap jokes, and so on and so forth. They get down to 75%, so it actually improves a bad lecture because you don't have to watch as much of the stuff. But of course, it's not enough. Virtual classroom is one way of going in this. In other words, don't do the live lecture. Start off with a virtual classroom. Why not? I've done lots of these. It means you don't have to travel all over the planet. Your students can watch them anywhere. they can be automatically recorded, and you have active learning, of course, through chat and all sorts of things as the thing goes. Now, coming up the ladder a little bit here, so recording lectures is one thing. Shortening lectures is one thing. Actually doing webcasts is one thing. But this guy really broke the mold, and he did something incredibly simple. This is Eric Mazur from Harvard. He was teaching kids physics at Harvard. He gave them a test in physics. These are top-class students paying a fortune to be there. And he found that actually their knowledge of Newton's 3 laws at the end of the first year was almost non-existent because they were actually good mathematicians. You can skate through a physics course doing the maths quite, if you're smart, without knowing much of the conceptual physics. So he stopped. And in the second year, stopped his lectures and started using peer assessment. In other words, he asked the students, he was quiz-led, a bit like Sebastian Thrun stuff. He would stop and ask them questions in natural language about physics, and they all had clickers, and it would come up with an anonymous histogram. And if the student body in his lecture hall didn't get it right, he would put them in groups. They would do peer-to-peer learning. Now, I know many of you have probably tried this before. You can actually do it with little colored cards anyway. In fact, he did a study showing that cards, clickers, makes no difference. But the astonishing thing about this is the way in which, if you that very simple act of stopping, diagnosing whether your students have actually got or understood what you've said, if the majority are correct, fine, move on to the next thing. If they're not, get them to stop, discuss, test them again, move on. And he does this several times during the 1 hour lecture so that it's no longer the 1 hour talking at the students. And his results, I won't bore you with the detail and the stats on this, but they are astonishing. And he is changing the whole face of maths and science teaching in the US by a very simple piece of technology, painfully simple. But other things are here, and there are other ways, I think, which you can climb the ladder even further and very quickly at very little cost. One is the management of learning. Now, I believe you have Blackboard here, which is fine. It's a powerful system, probably underutilized in my experience when you go in and look at the way in which this stuff's used in institutions. And to be fair, people, you're busy, you don't have enough time to look at the functionality, get used to it, acquire the skills. But 5,000 higher education institutions have this. Many, many people have simple, free, open source stuff like Moodle. A little sort of, you heard it here first, I think Moodle will be taken over by Google and will be put into the cloud and will be made free for all education worldwide soon as part of the Google Education package. The two are talking to each other, Totara. But the great boon here, remember when I said pedagogic change? Open source, open educational resources, that's all happened in the last 10 years. We didn't have this stuff prior to that. When it comes to content, actually, wading through YouTube EDU and iTunes U is a bit of a chore because most of it's just slabbed up 1 hour lectures. And I'm sure that when you go into your specific subject domain and try and find a really good lecture that you might want to reuse in these things, you don't find them. And these are some of the top educational institutions on the planet. And you know what? Most of the lectures are rubbish. I'll tell you right now, I've waded through hours and hours of this stuff. It's mostly unusable because it wasn't very good in the first place. However, if you do want to look at educational resources on a wider scale, then JISC have a really good portal here which you can examine this stuff on, and I'd highly recommend it because there's a lot better stuff available than would be suggested by YouTube EDU. This is a very interesting area for those who are involved in more vocational learning and include things like medicine and so on in that area. When you look at what young people actually do in the web, a huge amount of traffic, there's a good book on this called Click, is about how to do things. I recently had the window in my car wouldn't wind up. So I got my iPad out, and there was a guy in Northampton called Jim who had actually put a video up on how to fix this problem. I've never met Jim, no idea who he is. But it did solve my problem, And it solves the problems for millions of people globally when they have something they can't do and want to learn it. You're certainly not going, I'm not going to go do a course at my local college of car mechanics, am I? Interesting, I told this story to somebody who had the same problem in a Honda CR-V, and he took it into the garage, and the mechanic went onto YouTube. How bizarre is that? This is actually the top search for a how-to thing in the States. Kids learning how to tie a tie because kids don't wear school uniforms there. And when they go to McDonald's for their first job or a wedding, they have no idea how to tie a necktie. How surprising is this stuff? And when you look at what kids look for, it's how to flirt, how to cook, you know, how to get promotion, how to get a job. It's practical things in life, the things we never teach in institutions, to be frank. And, of course, there are some big players, and I've already mentioned Google. You have Apple entering the educational market. Wikipedia is already there. There are some big players who are looking at taking a bite of this very big pie. And it's no longer a case that the textbook rules. Writing a textbook is no longer enough, because a textbook on its own, without some formative assessment and feedback and proper teaching, is next to useless. When you have an alternative which weighs nothing, and you can get 10,000 of them on an iPad, but they also have formative assessment, so that when you're doing stupid work, homework, which is what teachers call it, homework, imagine calling it that, and you go home and you get stuck in your maths, and you've got the textbook, it doesn't help you one damn bit. But if you have a sophisticated piece of software, which Apple and others like Pearson's My Maths Lab, 4.5 million people pay to use that piece of software. 4.5 million. John Wiley, McGraw-Hill, they're all at it. People are coming into this area. And content, adaptive learning. You know, when I drove from Brighton to Derby, traditionally you might have got an atlas out, you know, and sat next to it. Actually, the way, I'm trying to do this analogy between a learning journey and a real journey. Actually, by delivering lectures, it's almost like taking a real person in you next to the car that you have to ask for directions every 5 minutes all the way to Derby and dumping them off. Of course, what people had then was atlases, the equivalent of books, and then you would go on the internet and print out one page, wouldn't you? And it would say it was X number of miles to Derby, it'll take you that long, blah, blah, blah. And now, of course, we have sat-nav. And what's happening with software is that sat-nav support is coming into play. So in this system is a Scottish company called Cogbooks. When you're actually going through a maths problem or whatever, it actually knows how far you've come, how far you've still got to do, what problems other learners have had with this particular area. It crowdsources stuff. It gives you scaffolding as you go forward, contextual stuff. So it's like an incredibly smart sat-nav as it moves through the content. And I think that is happening now. Companies like K. Newton and Carnegie are going for ridiculous sums of money in the States because they know that this accelerates learning, that this is learning squared. Social media. You know, the numbers are absolutely astonishing here. Just at Davos, there was an announcement that, you know, we're just past the 2 billion point of people online. 2 billion. 2 billion people are online. Google, 120 million searches an hour. Wikipedia is the 5th most popular website on the web. A knowledge educational site is the 5th most popular thing on the internet. And people say the internet's just full of rubbish and people just do odd and boring things. Facebook, 800 million. This is actually heading towards 1 billion. They're aiming for 1 billion on their float. This is a lot of people. If you want to find out where your students are, I'll tell you where they are. They're here. They're in this little thing. And they're there nearly every half hour. How often do you see them? Twitter, 200 million, Flickr. You know, this is just massive, this stuff. This is where you have to go if you really want to reach the minds of young people. And I like this, I put this in at the last minute, I found this on the internet. Twitter, I need to pee. Facebook is I peed, you know, recording it. Foursquare, if you've ever used that as a location, but this is where I pee. Quora is why am I peeing. YouTube is look at this pee. And LinkedIn is I'm really good at peeing. But I like this because it's sort of something, you know, replace peeing by any activity at all, even a learning activity, and it sort of sums up the power of social media as well. It covers all the bases. Covers all the bases for me, certainly. And don't think Facebook is irrelevant for you here because it is being used in anger now. Sheryl Sandberg, the CEO at Davos, gave a brilliant speech where she explained why she thinks social media will be a massive envelope which educators can use. One, I've already said, they're all there, bar none. It's sort of peer groups by definition. I like the notion of peer learning because I was hugely influenced by a woman called Judith Harris, whom Steven Pinker reckons is, was one of the most important books in psychology in the last 20 years, the nurture assumption. Kids learn from their peers. They learn to smoke weed from their peers, but they also learn useful things from their peers. And if we don't tap into that peer learning, we're missing something incredibly powerful. And Facebook groups do this. You needn't friend students if you have groups. That's the difference between a page and a group. You have to get to know Facebook a little bit to know the functionality. There are some brilliant tools and apps available now on the learning front, which are being used by top-flying educational institutions. And, of course, it's automatically mobile because loads of people use it on their mobile anyway. I particularly like this example. It's from a school, but don't worry about it too much. This girl, Millie, down in Taunton, teaches her A-level geography students. And she has a blog called My Teaching Blog. Sorry, What I Taught Today. And her students have mirror blogs, What I Learned Today. Absolutely brilliant example of the use of social media. And she has things like Cite Me. If you want to have a citation in a paper, you simply click this Facebook app, and it will come up with a format, Harvard, whatever, and you cut and paste it in. How many people have had real problems with students knowing how to use citations properly? And how many wasted hours and weeks do students spend trying to get the stupid commas and formats and capitalization in citations when there is a simple app that's absolutely free on Facebook? And of course, 101 other things, YouTube, SlideShare, lots of tools you can use in the context of Facebook itself, because social media, even for your own professional development, it's becoming almost necessary to be part of these networks if you do want to find things, keep up to date, build a trusted network, communicate, get productivity gains, collaborate, share resources and ideas. That's where the action is these days. And if you really want to know about e-learning and the advances in technology, then it is social media, it is blogs. That's where the leading wave of stuff is found. Not in the journals, interestingly. Nobody in our field reads the academic journals. Everybody knows Sugata Mitra, everybody from YouTube. I've yet to meet somebody who's read his paper in the Journal of Educational Technology. It takes too long. Peer learning I've mentioned. I was in the Middle East a lot last year. I was in Syria just the week before it all kicked off, Egypt several times, crossing the Gulf states. And everywhere I went, it was on a project looking at social media. This is before a lot of this exploded. Now, if social media can allow young people in the Arab world to replace governments, don't you think it might have a role in education? Don't you have an inkling that it might have some force and potency? Because that's exactly what happened in Tunisia and Egypt. And when I went into internet cafes, they all had laptops open. They were all on Facebook. Apart from Libya. Libya wasn't a Facebook event, that was more Twitter. In fact, it was so powerful, Twitter, that the fighters out in the front line were feeding back the coordinates for NATO bombing. Twitter became the tool for planning. Even Wikipedia page, the Wikipedia map of Libya was being used by the rebels to map their progress. You had, dashed for just outside the town, in the town, having taken the town. It really played, it was a necessary condition for the success of these revolutions. It wasn't the sole cause, it wasn't necessary and sufficient, but it wouldn't have taken, these revolutions would not have taken place, I think, and the evidence is coming out, I think, to show this, if these media had not existed. Now, let's bring it back to earth, guys, because I think in terms of your work here, there are some really interesting things happening in peer learning here. There are some good open source, this one, University of Glasgow, called Aropa. The interesting thing about peer learning is it works better with large courses. The more students you have, the better. Because when you're matching students up to judge each other's work, you have more choice with a bigger pool. It's like the more data you have, the more intelligent the inferences can be from that data. There's Peerwise, which is a slightly different system. PeerMark. Very, very sophisticated things happening on bits of open source, free software that allow you to cope with large numbers of students because they're learning a bit from each other. Let's not imagine that some direct instruction is not necessary at all. And I'm not too sure that many people would buy Sugata's notion of we knock down the university and just put a number of computers in a wall in Derby and hope for the best. But the fuel mixture has to be right here between exposition, lectures, formative feedback, and, in my view, peer learning. Because Judith Harris showed us that it's massively scalable. You get this group bonding, and you get a massive increase, interestingly, in some of those other skills that we're all desperate to look at, which is critical thinking. These are the big pluses of peer learning. And if you want some concrete proof, then I think it's a very good paper, this in Science, where two groups were compared on one little course in physics on the magnetic spectrum The group that just experienced lectures from an experienced and highly trained instructor, this is a guy who'd been teaching physics for years, scored 41% in the assessment. They put in somebody who had never done any lecturing before, but just did a sort of active learning course. The peer staff produced 74%, higher attendance and more engagement. I think this is, I mean, there are plenty of papers around like this. The idea that e-learning doesn't work or it's unproven is just simply a stupid question now, to be frank. You know? If you've ever taken an EasyJet plane, don't you think that pilot has been on several hours of e-learning simulation work? Don't you think that's probably where he learned to fly the plane? Do you think that guy who landed in the Potomac River, do you think he had never been on a simulator? Don't you think he saved their lives because he had gone through e-learning courses? We've had 60 years of flight simulations showing that this stuff works. Plenty of other evidence that shows that it works in other domains. Those days are gone. Then we have mobile learning. Everything's smaller, cheaper, faster, better, wireless, you know. I've got something in my pocket here. This thing, you probably can't even see this from the back. This is an iPod Nano. And I have 500 podcasts in here. I've been doing an experiment with myself. I downloaded all those, you know that In Our Time stuff on Radio 4? Anybody listen to that in the morning? Absolutely fantastic. Mostly academics coming on and being really focused on a narrow topic. 20 minutes or 40 minutes. 500 of them I have on this thing. It's about the size of a watch. In fact, you can buy a little watch strap for it. And I said I drove up to Derby. I don't drive. My wife drove up to Derby. I don't drive. But I spend a lot of time in public transport and in non-places like airports and railway stations. And this is absolutely fantastic because you're free with earphones to take notes. So even something as simple as an iPod can produce unbelievable amplification and scalability in terms of content and learning if we just use a bit of our imagination. E-assessment. I think this is a classic e-assessment question, Pythagoras' theorem. Find x. Now, I've been a business person all my life, and I've employed loads of young people. And I would much rather employ this kid than any kid who knows Pythagoras' theorem, to be frank. It shows humor, smartness, a bit of innovation, it's just absolutely perfect for me. Coming at my interview, you get a job straight away if you've answered in this way, because our assessments are atrocious by and large. A bit scrappy when you have to write those exam questions every year, and you have to make sure that they're different from last year. But things are happening on this front, and if you look at the systems that are out there, they're becoming incredibly sophisticated with regard to the real assessment, not only of knowledge, but performance. For example, in flight simulators, the exam I give you, you really are assessing those pilots through performance. They don't have to sit a paper exam to fly your jet. They've already been through the simulator. The very act of completion itself, which was Salman Khan's point, if you've actually completed the course, I know that you have 100% competence. That's what we should aim at. And that's what software does in a way. It checks that. It's infinitely patient. And doesn't do what AQA and EdXL in Cambridge did last year, which is send out exam papers, A-level exam papers with questions which the students couldn't answer. Isn't that bizarre? Those people hadn't even checked the paper with a single student. How appalling is that in terms of quality control? And what happened when that happened? Do you think that Ofqual went back and punished them in any way or said that's not right? No, Ofqual said, oh, we can statistically compensate. Now, I don't know if you remember sitting in an exam, but did you ever come across a question that was so fiendishly difficult it completely threw you psychologically? Because that's what happened to those kids. And there's no way they could statistically compensate for that. They were guessing, they were embarrassed, and they did nothing. Because the thing's crumbling, the whole paper examination thing. You know, the very fact, what technology do we use for examinations? Pen and pencil. My kids look at a pencil as if it was an Egyptian artifact. They don't use the damn thing. I think this may be actually skewing results in exams because, it may be affecting your ability to answer the questions, the speed at which you can write. And think, even in a subject like English literature, suppose I'm asking you to write an essay, but not using a word processor. Anybody who writes anything knows that the art of writing a critique or a good bit of deep analysis is through cutting and pasting and restructuring the work. You never write anything on first draft and regard it as even remotely useful or sensible. And yet what do? We demand that kids do that using a pencil and a bit of paper. We don't give them a word processor, which is where you'll do all your writing when you leave the educational institution. There is something completely bizarre about assessment being stuck in the world of pencils. I like to read this one from the author of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Everything that's already in the world when you're born is normal. That was true of me, like fridges, washing machines. Anything that gets invented between then and before you turn 30 is incredibly exciting and creative, and with any luck, you can make a career out of it. Hey, e-learning, that's what we've done. Anything invented after you're 30 is against the natural order of things and the beginning of the end of civilization as we know it, until it's been around for about 10 years when it gradually turns out to be all right, really. And, you know, I'm almost stopped going to dinner parties now because if you're in an educational group, whenever Facebook's mentioned, you just get, why would I want to post that I'm having a cup of tea and all that banal critique. But people who don't really know what the medium is, have never used it, and don't understand that people never write the sentence, I've just had a cup of tea in Twitter. They put links in to concrete research. It's a life-enhancing experience, and you'll learn tons from it. That's the truth of the matter. And I think we have to be very careful in almost saying, you know, those lines that I mentioned earlier, like, it's not about the technology. Well, it damn well is. You know, so I sometimes bring my little iPod out just to look at it. Yeah, cool, it's brilliant, this, you know. It is about the technology. I love this little object. And my kids, you know, they love I'm sure your kids demand what model of phone you're going to buy for them, on what contract. Things are no, you know, everything's negotiable now with kids. It wasn't negotiable with my dad. He would have given me a background deal and sent me packing. But the demand is there because the allure of the technology is what drives young people, not just its functionality. They love this stuff. And if you're going to use it properly, you have to love it as well. Now, I'm going to end in this slide because I said at the beginning about this notion of the pedagogy has radically changed in the last 10 years. I think the major causal factor in pedagogic change now is technology. I have no doubt about that. And these are the people who are changing the learning landscape now. There's only one Englishman up here, and that's Tim Berners-Lee, who gave us that wonderful gift, which is the World Wide Web itself. Jeff Bezos. Anybody here never used Amazon? It's okay if you haven't. It's cool. Right. And isn't it fantastic when you open that cardboard box, even that act of tearing the cardboard and that crisp book falls out? You know, because that's changed the way we look at buying books. Jeff Bezos did that for us. If you live in the remote area especially, you don't have access to bookshops or whatever. Jimmy Wales, who I think should get a Nobel Prize. And when Wikipedia came out and I used to do these talks, I used to get ripped by people who thought it was a load of rubbish and would never last and was full of errors and so on. And now, believe me, there's barely a student on the planet that doesn't use it in anger. And I suspect lots of academics as well. And it's mostly academics who write the stuff when you look at the profile of the editors. A wonderful thing. Of course, the late great Steve Jobs, who gave us this whole podcasting thing and many other things in terms of the Apple movement. And then we have, you know, the stuff that you know, Facebook guys, Twitter, YouTube. This is the stuff that's come of age. You know, I put Julian Assange in there just because I like him anyway. It didn't really affect the learning world. This guy, Torvalds, though, he was the guy who gave us open source. A bunch of sort of geeky programmers got together. They always learned from each other through peer learning because they have to reskill you almost every 1 or 2 years. And they always use user groups to learn and find things out. And this is the guy who's really responsible for this whole open source movement, I think, in education. Open educational resources, or the Moodle phenomenon. And I think we should be grateful for him as that. So, in a sense, resistance is futile. But this is good, because these are wonderful gifts by wonderful people, which we can use, and most of them are free. What's the biggest problem we have in higher education at the moment? The cost. I have twin boys who are 18. They want to go to university next year. If I send them to a 9,000 a year institution, that's 18 grand a year for 3-4 years, plus the lost income. Let's say that's 15 grand each a year. That's another 30,000 a year for 3 years they'll lose, plus the living costs on top of that. I'm looking, well, we as a family are looking at 100 grand a pop. And we don't think cost is an issue. We don't think that the deliverable has remained the same, but the cost is going up and up and up to the ridiculous American model, where it's now $30,000 a year. And the only solution to lowering that cost and improving or keeping the level of teaching and learning at the right level, I think, is this scalable use of technology. And I'll end on that point. Thanks very much for listening.